Hey painters, it's Ronnie Bringle. I have a few more things to show you. Before adding the next step to the smooshed pear, I want to show you a different kind of smooshing. We smooshed in with a round technique on the pear because the pear is round, but we also a lot of times are going to paint linear things, either horizontal or vertical, and we can smoosh color onto those linear things just like we do with the round elements, but we just have to use a little bit different technique. To smoosh for a linear shape, you can use the round Bringle blender, you can use the flat Bringle blender, or you can use the oval. It really doesn't matter which one you use, but it's going to depend on the shape and the size of your element. I've drawn a shelf underneath the pear so that we can see a linear element here that's horizontal, and I'll paint that. I'll show you how to do that with I'm going to use the oval Bringle blender. Remember now, we're going to moisten the brush and blot it. When we feel in our fingers, it doesn't feel wet. It feels just a little bit damp. I'm going to make kind of a brown colored shelf, so I'll pick up a little bit of a light tan color. Now I've got quite a bit in my brush. Remember, you're going to be working with quite a bit of paint, and I'm going to lay this on. Instead of working circular, I'm going to swish back and forth, and to create my edge, remember I'm going to point the tip out to the edge, slide that along. If I need to loosen my paint, I'm going to pick up a drop of water, come back here, push the paint out to the edge, and I want to work fairly fast so that I can work wet into wet if possible. I'm going to blot my brush a little bit and pick up my second color, a little bit darker brown now. I'll place this color just right where I want it, and I'm going to swish it or whisk it into my first color. Again, I'm going to make sure I get those outside pattern lines covered up. I'm going to blot a little bit, and then I'm just going to swish these two colors together. So this is smooshing only, instead of smooshing round, you're whisking back and forth. I'll pick up my darker color again, place this out here along this edge, whisk it back and forth, and as much as possible I'll work wet into wet, but if my first color dries, I'll just whisk some of the wet color over the dry. I've got the dark on my brush, so in the area up above where I want to place some dark value, I'll place that right in here, right kind of around the pear. Then I'll go to my light color. I'm just blotting my brush lightly in between. These two colors work well together, so I don't really have to wash the brush in between. I'm just going to blot them a little bit. Now I'm swishing back and forth. I've got the light color on my brush this time, so this time I'll start with the light. We're just ignoring that other pear over there. It doesn't matter which color you start with, you just have to put the right color in the right spot. And then I'll swish and whisk these colors together. You can work wet into wet, or you can work wet over dry. But remember, this is not the final look. This is a value placed base coat. So we're going to let the shelf dry, and I'll come back to the pear, and we'll touch on that shelf again a little bit later. The next step on the pear is to do a dry stipple. I use the dry stipple to place intense color in a very specific spot. For the purpose of this demonstration, because when I put a white or a very light colored palette out, it changes the lighting from my camera. So I've prepped this piece of dark paper, and I'm going to use this as my palette, but you remember you're going to use your white paper palette. I'm also going to show you the technique on just a plain piece of prepped paper, and then after I show you the technique, I'll show you how to apply it to the pear. Remember, again, the brush is damp, we wash it, rinse it, blot it, and when you feel it, it doesn't make your fingers wet. Back up a little bit. We're going to pick up the paint from the center of the puddle. Now this is an important step. A lot of painters pick up their paint from the edge of the puddle, but for my techniques, especially the dry stippling, you want to make sure you're picking up the paint from the center of the puddle so that you don't pick up water from your wet paper towel. So pick up that paint, and I've got quite a bit on my brush, and on my palette I'm going to stipple. Remember, this is my white palette. I'm going to stipple that color into my brush, and you can see my fingers my hand kind of going around. I want to make sure this is evenly distributed within the brush. Now I'm going to back off on the handle a little bit so you can actually see this stippling. Just straight up and down, and it's all getting stippled into the brush. Once you have that in place, then you're going to blot off the excess. So on my cloth, I'm going to blot off the excess and stipple a time or two just to make sure I don't have too much in there. We're basically using a dry brush. So when I start stippling, I'm going to put this brush down exactly where I want it, and I'm going to stipple firmly to create this nice little kind of a blurry, soft look of color. Now, you don't want it to be too harsh. If you have too much water or too much paint on your brush and you start to stipple, then it's going to look like this, too harsh. And what people do then, a lot of times, is they think, okay, that's too much, I have to stipple more lightly. If you stipple lightly, then you're going to have texture. You're going to have a teddy bear instead of a pear. So you don't want to stipple lightly, you want to stipple firmly. So to correct that, you would blot your brush some more and make sure that it's doesn't have too much paint or too much water on it, so that you can stipple firmly. You can hear me stippling and create a softened look of color. Now we don't want to do kind of a random all over stipple where you just kind of go like this. That is going to make you have a polka dot look. You are trying to create color in one very specific area. You want to set the brush down where you know you want the most of that color and stipple to the point where you want those edges to disappear. Then we come to the second part of stippling, which is dry rubbing. So once I've stippled most of the color out of my brush, then I'm going to lay the brush down and just do a little bit of circular dry rubbing. Now I don't want to dry rub across where I just stippled because I don't want to lift it up. So we'll wait just a few seconds, and then we can dry rub right across that and it won't lift it. If you just don't have enough paint on your brush to continue with the dry rubbing, then you can add paint to your brush, but you want to make sure that you blot, work it into the brush, and make sure you blot most of it out. Then you can come back and do this dry rubbing. Now dry rubbing does not create transparent color, it creates broken color. So it's kind of like, instead of looking through the glass in your window, you're looking through the screen. So let's apply this to the pear. I'm going to go into the center of my puddle, pick up my paint, and on my palette I'm going to stipple it into my brush thoroughly. Then blot it on my cloth and stipple a little bit on my cloth. I'm going to set this here so you can see how I stipple on the cloth. This is where I want to create a nice round fatness to the pear. So I'm going to set my brush down right in the center of that and stipple the white cloth is causing some lighting problems again, so we'll get rid of that. I'm stippling to create this nice light fat area on the pear. Once I've got it kind of as big as I want it, then I'm going to lay the brush down and do dry rubbing all around that outer edge. Now I want to create another light area on this part of the pear, so I'm going to go to a little bit smaller brush. I'm going to use the same color, the same technique, load up the brush, and you really have to load it up, don't be stingy. Blot off the excess and stipple it a time or two. Then stipple where you want that color to be the most intense. Stipple till it gets to be about as big as you want it. If you feel like your brush is still too wet, blot it a little bit. And then dry rub all around those outer edges. So that's step 2 on the pear. But dry rubbing is not just used on round things. It's also used on the linear things. But that takes us to another demo, and I think we'll do that next time. So I'll see you then.